Have you ever felt like no matter how much sleep you're getting, you're still not getting enough, or you're just tired throughout the day? There might be something involving your breathing that is preventing you from getting good quality deep sleep. When people talk about sleeping advice, they give a lot of tips on having a dark room or a cool room, or things you can do before bed, like relaxation or maybe taking a hot shower. And while all these things have their benefits, a lot of people neglect talking about the breathing. But the way you breathe when you're sleeping is probably one of the most important ways to ensure you're getting good quality sleep. Why is that the case? Well, oxygen. Your body needs oxygen to survive, and your body needs oxygen to enter deep sleep. And at the same time, your brain and your other cells need oxygen in order to thrive. And if you don't have enough oxygen, it's a one-step recipe to ensure getting fragmented or not quality sleep. Now, going off of that, it's not just about the oxygen that gets into our lungs. We need to make sure that that same oxygen gets all the way to our cells, like the cells in our brain. Now, I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. The biggest way you can fix your breathing is to switch from mouth breathing to nose breathing. What's the problem with mouth breathing? When you breathe through your mouth, you tend to take these shorter, quicker breaths, and you only really engage the upper half of your lungs. What this does is you end up getting a lot less oxygen. Yeah, you're still going to inhale a ton of oxygen into your lungs, but because you're breathing so quickly, you're not going to get as much oxygen delivered to your cells. You're also going to be more likely to snore, more likely to have sleep apnea, and you're more likely to have a dry mouth. And dry mouth means more likely to have cavities and gum disease, but that's just a side point. Estimates are right now that about 50% of kids are regular mouth breathers. And this can cause a lot of issues for them later on in life. And that's partly why I'm talking about it in this video. But it's not just for kids, even adults can benefit a ton from switching to nasal breathing. Now, I talked a couple times about getting that oxygen to go into our cells. So how can we ensure that that oxygen that enters our lungs makes its way to our cells? The answer is CO2, or carbon dioxide. And this is something called the Bohr effect. So when you check with a pulse oximeter, this is something that you put over your finger that measures how much oxygen you have. What this is really measuring is how much oxygen is in your lungs and saturating your hemoglobin. Because when oxygen comes into your lungs, it will attach to a molecule called hemoglobin. This hemoglobin is in your red blood cells, and this is what transfers that oxygen to all of your cells. So most people, when they check their pulse oximeter and they see how much oxygen they have, it'll be between 95 to 100%, which is really good. Now, if you are in a category where you do not have this much oxygen, then this video doesn't really apply to you. You might have a different medical condition like COPD, for example, and you need to go to your doctor to get this checked out. But for most people who are generally healthy, then they will have oxygen saturation between 95 to 100%. So I made a little drawing here to help explain what happens once oxygen enters your lungs and how it gets delivered to your cells. Now, don't mind this guy's slumped shoulders or anything like that. He's probably a mouth breather. Just a joke. But what happens is there's oxygen in the air, and this person breathes in, and this oxygen enters your lungs. Very simple. Once it enters your lungs, 4 of these oxygen molecules will attach to one of these hemoglobins, which is in your lungs. So one hemoglobin will carry 4 of these oxygens and transfer it in our red blood cells, like through our blood, to all of our cells. So this hemoglobin is basically like a train, and these oxygen molecules are the passengers. Now, in order for this hemoglobin to deliver this oxygen to our cells, like let's say the cells in our brain here, my lovely drawing of my brain, then these oxygen molecules need to be able to detach from this hemoglobin. This is where it gets a little tricky. In order for this oxygen to detach from this hemoglobin, we need to have a blood pH of 7.35. If we have a pH of 7.35, then this oxygen is able to dissociate from this hemoglobin and actually go to our cells, like the cells in our brain. Now, how can we ensure we have the right pH? Well, we need to have enough CO2. The CO2 is what determines our blood pH. So in order for us just to live, our pH needs to be between 7.35 and 7.45. If this number gets too high or too low, like if it gets below 6.8 or it gets above 7.8, then we can die. So it's very important. And the CO2 is what produces the molecules or what actively regulates our blood pH. Now, without enough CO2, then it's really hard for our body to control our pH. We have these buffers that our body can make to kind of buffer out the pH, but in order to make those buffers, you need to have enough CO2 in the first place. And what happens is if this threshold of this pH, 7.35, does not get hit, then these oxygen molecules will never detach from this hemoglobin. They will stay attached, and your brain will never get enough oxygen. And this is why you will wake up feeling exhausted. And this is literally the concept of the Bohr effect, where if you don't have enough CO2, then even if you're breathing in oxygen, your cells are not going to get that oxygen. So how can you fix this? How can you make sure that you have enough CO2 so that you have the right pH to make sure that your oxygen is actually going to your cells? Well, the simplest way is to start breathing through your nose, because when you breathe in and out of your nose, you're going to breathe a lot slower than when you breathe in and out of your mouth. Talked before about people who are mouth breathers. They tend to take these shorter, shallower breaths and only engage the upper half of their lungs. Nose breathers tend to breathe a lot slower, and they tend to engage their full lungs capacity. And they also involve their diaphragm. Your diaphragm is this muscle that rests below your lungs. And when you engage your diaphragm, it also encourages that you're using your lungs' full capacity. And the reason that breathing slower and engaging your lungs' full capacity is so important is because you don't get CO2 from your air. You get oxygen from the air. There's about 21% oxygen in our air, but there's only 0.03% CO2 in our air. You only get CO2 from pretty much holding your breath, or you get more from exercising. So when your body is just doing its normal metabolism, it produces CO2. So in order to get more CO2, you need to breathe slower, because when you're breathing in and out of your nose and you're breathing slower, now you're exhaling less often, and you're giving your body more time to build up this CO2 to its natural level. Now, at first, when you're switching towards nose breathing, this can be a little difficult because, for one, mouth breathing literally causes nasal congestion. And the reason for that is when your body senses that it's losing too much CO2, like when you're breathing in and out of your mouth and you're breathing quicker, then it's going to start producing more mucus. There's something called these goblet cells that are in your nose, and your body produces more of them to, in a way, slow down your breathing. But it's kind of like a never-ending cycle, because the more quicker that you breathe, the more CO2 that you're losing, the more nasal congestion that you get. And as a result, the more you're going to rely on mouth breathing and breathing quicker in the first place. The other reason this might be hard to transition to nose breathing all the time is because your CO2 is what triggers you to take the next breath. So once your CO2 builds up to a certain point, it's going to basically trigger your brainstem to take the next breath. And if you're breathing really quickly, you're going to have much lower levels of CO2 than normal. And as a result, that CO2 threshold gets lower. So instead of your CO2 threshold having to build up to here to take the next breath, it only has to build up to like here, and then you're going to take the next breath. So as a result, you're going to be taking these shallower, quicker breaths, and you're going to have a lot less CO2 than you want. So that's why I said breathing through your nose at all times, like during the day, focusing on it, especially when you're resting, like watching TV or something like that, or at work, is going to be so helpful. And also making sure you're breathing through your nose at nighttime, like when you're sleeping. So how can you do that? Well, there's things like a mouth tape that you can literally tape your lips shut when you're breathing. I use something called a 3M micropore paper tape, which is literally a piece of tape that you rip off, put over your lips. It's a medical grade tape that is safe for the skin, and this will encourage you to breathe in and out of your nose. If you don't have a beard like me, you can put this strip of tape vertically so that you can still breathe through your mouth if you have to. So it's kind of a resistance to keep your lips closed to encourage nose breathing, but it's not going to force you. You can also use things like a nasal dilator strip or a nasal decongestant spray, which is like a spray you put in each of your nostrils to help unblock your nose before you're sleeping. So some of you might need to use like an actual nasal rinse before you sleep. The one that I'd recommend is a NeilMed Sinus rinse. It is a sterile rinse that you can get over the counter that you basically squirt in one nostril and it'll get all the gunk out the other nostril. And you want to do this through both of your nostrils. And you might also have allergies that are contributing to this. So you might even need to take an allergy medication. Now, I go into this in detail in some of my other videos, and I'm putting a link in the description below if you want to watch that, because it gets a little complicated and there's a specific step in order to make sure you do this correctly to properly unblock your nose. And there's actually a nose unblocking exercise that you can do as well. So check out the link in the description below where you can learn more about that. But there's a lot more that goes into this too. It also involves your tongue. Like, you want to have proper tongue posture. People who grow up with proper mouth posture, where their lips are closed, their teeth are slightly touching, and their tongue is resting against the roof of their mouth, not just the tip of their tongue, but the middle and back part of their tongue, they're going to basically grow up as nose breathers. Because when your tongue is in this position growing up, it's impossible to breathe through your mouth. You might try it at home and say like, oh, I can still breathe through my mouth. Well, that means you're not doing it right. Your tongue should be suctioned against the roof of the mouth, where that middle and back part of your tongue are touching the roof of the mouth as well. When you're doing this, you're basically forced to breathe in and out of your nose. Now, before I move on, some of you might have something called a tongue tie. A tongue tie is basically where your tongue is glued to the floor of your mouth. You have this attachment that connects your tongue to the floor of your mouth. And if this attachment is way too short and it's basically restricting your tongue movement, then you have a tongue tie. If this is the case, you might need a simple surgery where you basically get that tongue tie clipped to ensure more freedom with the tongue. A simple test that you can do to see if you really need a tongue tie surgery is try keeping your tongue against the roof of the mouth in that proper tongue posture and open your mouth as wide as you can with your tongue in that position. If you can fit 2 fingers overlapped like this in your mouth when your tongue is in that position while your mouth is open, then you're pretty much good. You don't really need to get a surgery. So the test will kind of look like this. Now, you want to make sure that your hands are clean before doing this. I was just touching this whiteboard here, so I don't want to put my hands directly all the way in my mouth, and probably wouldn't want to do this anyway, but that's besides the point. Now, usually when you get this tongue tie surgery, if you need one, this will involve some tongue exercises. Now, these tongue exercises are good to do regardless. And actually, I made a specific video on tongue exercises. Now, I know I talked about a few other videos that I already made that are related to this video, but these are all important for very specific reasons. So check out the link in the description below if you want to learn more about specific tongue exercises that can actually strengthen your tongue and encourage your tongue to be in the right position. These exercises not only help with your overall posture, but they can also help with your sleep and your actual speech. Now, before I get going, something else that you can simply do is to just fix your sleeping position. And this can also help your breathing when you're sleeping. For people who are mouth breathers, sleeping on your back is terrible. I know a lot of people think that sleeping on your back is a great position, and it can be if you have proper mouth posture. If your tongue is touching the roof of the mouth and you are a nose breather, then sleeping on your back is fine. But for people who have their mouth open and their tongue is not touching the roof of their mouth, their tongue will tend to fall back and cut off their breathing. This can lead to things like snoring, which means you have restricted breathing and you're going to have fragmented sleep. And it can even completely cut off your breathing and completely block your breathing tubes, and this will cause sleep apnea, where you're literally choking yourself in your sleep. So ideally, if you are a mouth breather or you're worried about your tongue falling back, on top of just trying to fix that nasal breathing habit, try sleeping on your side. Now, if you switch from back sleeping to side sleeping, you might need to change your pillow. You might even need to get a taller pillow to make sure that your head stays in line with your spine, but this will help prevent that tongue from falling back and cutting off your breathing. Or at the very least, if you are a back sleeper and you're not going to change, try getting a mattress that can kind of tilt up a little bit to encourage that tongue to not fall back as much. Now, again, I made another video on proper sleeping positions a little bit more in detail, so I'm putting another video in the description below as well if you want to check that one out. Now, with that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned something about the importance of how you breathe when you're sleeping and how much of a difference it can make and how much oxygen is getting to your brain and how you're actually feeling the next day. And I know I threw a lot at you, so you might have to watch the video again, or you might have to check out some of the other content I talked about in my description below, or even some of the other videos I made on my channel. And that'll really help you understand this whole concept and how you can make some changes to help your breathing lifestyle. As always, if you haven't already, hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to my channel below. And I will see you in the next video. If you've been on the internet for the last few years, you might have heard of mewing before. It's basically where people tell you to put your tongue in a certain posture and put your chin in a certain posture, and it's supposed to transform your jawline and make you have this nice chiseled looking face. But there's a good chance if you've just watched some TikTok videos on it and been copying